Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're breaking down a really controversial take on the Russia-Ukraine war, a narrative that suggests the whole conflict might actually be scripted. The source material we're looking at presents a world where the events we see on the news are just one layer of a much deeper, hidden strategy. So let's dive in and see how this story unfolds. All right, so the story we're examining today kicks off on a very specific date in the future. It paints a picture of June 5th, 2025, right on the brink of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. But just as there's a glimmer of hope, a shocking event happens that just blows everything up. According to the source, Ukraine launches this massive drone attack called Operation Spider's Web. Now, the scale of this thing is what's really wild. We're talking 117 drones hitting targets up to 4,000 kilometers deep inside Russia. The story goes that these drones were launched from ordinary-looking commercial trucks, getting super close to their targets, and they managed to destroy 40 Russian bombers, wiping out more than a third of its cruise missile capacity. It's framed as a massive, humiliating blow. And Russia's response in this narrative is immediate and furious. President Putin reportedly cancels the peace talks on the spot, flat out saying he will not negotiate with terrorists. At the same time, Russian missiles and drones start hammering the city of Kharkiv. But then, something even more chilling happens. A mysterious Russian military radio station known as UVB-76, or the Doomsday radio, flickers to life. And this isn't just random static. The source makes a huge point that this same signal was activated right before the 2014 Crimea invasion, and again, just before the big 2022 war. So its activation is like a giant blinking red light signaling something major is coming. And all of this brings us to the real heart of this whole narrative. It's what the source calls the sanctions paradox. This idea that the war, and all the Western sanctions that came with it, were supposed to destroy Russia, but somehow they ended up making it stronger. Which, makes you ask the million-dollar question that this whole story is built around. If the entire goal was to bring the Russian economy to its knees, how on earth did the complete opposite happen? How does a strategy meant for destruction actually lead to a boom? Just look at this comparison. It really lays out the crazy reversal at the center of this story. On one side, you've got the West's goal, push Russia into an economic dark age. But on the other side, the reality this story presents is that Russia enters a golden age, while it's the EU and the UK that get slammed with massive inflation, protests, and economic chaos. It's completely flipped on its head. So how does the source explain this incredible paradox? Well, this is where it makes its boldest claim. It says this wasn't some mistake. It wasn't a miscalculation. Nope. It argues that the entire war was, in a way, scripted, with the US and the EU pulling the strings and basically using Ukraine as a pawn that was always meant to be sacrificed. Now, to even begin to make a claim that huge, the narrative says we have to hit rewind. We need to go back to a time, and it really wasn't that long ago, when Russia and Ukraine weren't enemies at all. In fact, they saw themselves as brother nations. And this wasn't just talk. The source points to some pretty profound acts of trust. In 1954, Russia literally gifts the entire Crimean region to Ukraine as a symbol of friendship. A gift. And then after the Soviet Union collapses, Ukraine trusts Russia so much that it hands over its entire nuclear arsenal. There was a seriously deep bond there. So what happened? Well, according to this story, everything fell apart in one critical 6-month window. In 2013, Ukraine's president says no to a trade deal with the EU, choosing one with Russia instead. Then, the source claims the West backed violent protests, which the narrative flat out calls a coup that forced that democratically elected president right out of power. And sure enough, by June 2014, a new pro-Western government is in, and it immediately signs that EU deal. So, this huge political flip, as the source frames it, didn't just change who Ukraine's allies were. It basically put both countries on a collision course they couldn't turn back from. With this new government in power, you start to see policies changing, and fast. The focus shifts completely away from its old partner, Russia, and moves all in on aligning with Europe and the West, a move that, in this telling of the story, was deliberately antagonistic. The source pinpoints 3 huge escalations. First, a massive trade shift where the EU totally replaces Russia as Ukraine's top trading partner. Second, a big fight over the Russian gas pipeline, with Ukraine demanding more money and a 51% ownership stake. And third, and this is a big one, a 2016 pact with NATO that brings in a staggering $35 billion worth of weapons. And this is an absolutely crucial point in this narrative, because from Russia's point of view, as it's presented here, every move NATO made to the east wasn't just politics. It was an existential threat. It was like walls closing in, and adding Ukraine to that alliance, that would leave a huge chunk of its border exposed, making Russia feel totally and completely cornered. And the final piece of the puzzle, according to this story, Volodymyr Zelensky. He's portrayed as a comedian turned president who, supposedly swept up in this pro-Western fever, pushes hard for NATO membership. A move, the source says, basically drove his country headfirst into a devastating war. But what's interesting is, the story doesn't actually end with the war. It concludes by pulling out what it calls an ultimate lesson. A kind of practical strategy, it says, we can all learn from how Russia navigated this whole situation. It boils Russia's whole playbook down to this simple 3-step formula for building power. Step 1, figure out your unique strengths. What's something only you can do? Step 2, use that strength to create a monopoly so other people become dependent on you. And step 3, you become so indispensable that even your enemies, they have to work with you. They have no other choice. The source really drives this point home with an old Hindi proverb that translates to, one must tolerate the kicks of a milk-giving buffalo. The message is pretty blunt, right? If you're the only one providing something absolutely essential, whether it's milk or energy or resources, people are going to have to put up with you, no matter what. And hey, this isn't just a game for superpowers. The source points to the Netherlands as a perfect example. A tiny country, right? But it has a virtual monopoly on the incredibly complex machines needed to make semiconductor chips. Without those machines, our entire digital world just stops. That's real power. So, as we wrap up our look into this very specific and controversial narrative of the war, the source leaves us with one last question. It asks us to look past all the geopolitics and apply that same lesson to our own lives. What is it that makes you indispensable?